Check out that sick looking blade. New for 2010, that's a Spyderco Warrior knife. First seen here, at least in the Nutnfancy project, during my 2010 SHOT Show booth review, Spyderco. Our excellent hosts back then in January 2010 were Mr. Sal Glesser himself, owner of Spyderco, also Mr. Ed Shimp. Great host. Good time we had with those dudes. Thanks for hosting TMP, sure appreciate it. We talked about this blade. I told you I wanted one of these blades as soon as I saw it. This knife connected with me instantaneously, at least on the level of second type of cool. In other words, it's just a cool knife, especially coming from a company like Spyderco. I gotta be honest with you though, doing this Nutnfancy blade review on the Spyderco Warrior, a little bit intimidating. I'll deal with it, I'll handle it, get through it. Guys will say, why is it intimidating? Well, this is not a fresh from scratch design. I think to do it justice, to talk about and review the specifics of the Spyderco Warrior knife, you kind of need to understand its history and go back and understand that it is an evolution of a not very old, but a 1970s design. And it's updated, it has a slightly different philosophy than the original, which I think is cool. But yeah, the history of this blade goes back a bit. A lot of blades have interesting stories, honestly. I don't always delve into them, mainly for time and also interest. I have to be interested in it. I find the story of the Warrior knife, as it's called, fascinating. And it goes back to a group of badasses in the 1970s that were martial artists, kicking butts and taking names. You know, if you go back to the 70s, there weren't a lot of fighting knives that were purpose-built for a specific martial art, at least not that I know of. And let me give you a little caveat too throughout the whole review, is that I'm not into martial bladecraft. I wouldn't mind being into it, but it takes a devotion of life to become good at it, right? Just like any martial art, you need to devote your life to it and practice it and do it all the time. It's hard to fit that in my schedule. I sure respect it though. I think it's cool, and these guys were cool. One of the designers, Mr. Randy Warner, as I understand it, said, you know what? We need a knife that is suited to our style of martial art. And I'm going to probably mispronounce the names as we go along. I apologize. That martial art, as I understand it, was Hwarang-do. It's, I think, a form of Korean martial art. Enter the most excellent in a booklet, which actually Sal mentioned in our booth review, The Warrior Path, written by Michael Janik. Nice job. This is a very cool history of the Warrior knife and the evolution leading up to the Spyderco Warrior knife. You know, lots of history in here, and again, I could add a lot of video length in here. Suffice it to say, though, these guys said, Mr. Randy Warner mostly, and then it was actually brought to fruition and to reality by Bob Taylor, who added a lot of stuff. And there's Randy Warner on the right, Bob Taylor on the left, showing some combat techniques, disarming techniques with long guns, and some knife action there too. These guys were badasses, no doubt. And they had a very determined, or actually a very defined perception of what they wanted out of their blade. Randy decided they wanted a blade that would interface with human mechanics better than any other existing design. And he had almost an intuitive sense of what that blade would involve from his extensive martial arts experience. And by the way, there's another name kind of tied in to the Warrior knife mystique, if you will, and that was Michael Echanis. I like this book because in a lot of ways it sets the record straight on the Warrior knife, clarifies it. It's definitely a read, and by the way, I think it only comes with this knife when you buy it. All right, fair enough. Michael Echanis, as it turns out, didn't really have much to do with the design. You know, I think what he suggests is serrations on the back. I think that was his contribution. I may be off on that. Mostly the brainchild of, Randy Warner. Bob Taylor suggested the pommel, I think. So it was a collaborative effort, but mostly brought to fruition by Warner and Taylor. Again, getting back to the purpose of it. And this will talk to the purpose of the Spyderco Warrior knife as it is today. They wanted a knife that would, let me get to this page here in the booklet, that would fit the human body in combat with reverse grip, edge out. pretty much straight wrist combat techniques. And that's a little bit different than a lot of knife fighting that I've seen. These are some good pictures illustrating that. And to do that, they came up with an S curve on the blade. Look at the sweep on the blade. Continuous curve. All right, they also, on the original versions, had a hexagonal pommel that would provide some striking capability. We've seen that on some other knives. I've talked about it. I think that's very cool. Notice how he's striking with it, though. Again, this is all part of the martial art as they envision employing this knife. You have to understand that a warrior knife was envisioned as a specific knife to interface with their style of fighting. And then you can see the curvature of the blade and that style of thrust. And sure enough, that's what they created. It was a tough road, though. And here's some other pictures. It was a long time before they actually got any, I don't know, credible production going on the warrior knife. There's a first prototype made by a knife maker who tried to claim it as his own. There's some interesting story in here. I can't get into it just for time. They finally hooked up with Almar, though, and I'm skipping ahead. There were some other makers and iterations of the blade, but a lot of people know the warrior knife from the Almar version. Okay, but it really didn't live up to every specification set forth by Warner and Taylor. It was a heavier knife than they wanted. There were some specifications they deviated from, but the wheels were in motion by Almar, and to retool it and redo it was just too expensive, prohibitively so, and so they just went with it, and out came the Almar warrior knife, which I have handled in person. My overall impression is that it is a very heavy blade. Very heavy. I'm not against big blades. You guys know that. I love big blades. But in the POU of this knife, that is a fighting Marshall Bladecraft knife in the style that is recommended. I don't know. You know, again, I'm not Mr. Joe Bladecraft here, but maybe a little bit too heavy. That seemed to be the consensus. And by the way, these knives are highly collectible. If you can score an Almar Warrior, highly collectible. Came with letters of authenticity. There's the serrations. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. There's one there with a leather sheath. They had different steels. It was also, the history is kind of tied into the Soldier of Fortune conventions. And actually, that one dude who was at Michael Echanis, kind of a badass in the Soldier of Fortune world, came up with some fighting styles that he sold to the military, instructed special operations folks in them. He got involved in some covert operations. My understanding, I could be getting the details wrong, probably am, down in Nicaragua, and he got aced with some shady deals there, so he kind of got killed in an aircraft, so that sucked. Bob Taylor, though, pressed on with the design. These are some various pictures of the original warrior knife. Cool blade. I like this one, though. Where is it? Another company, after Almar, came out with one. It was a smaller version called the Hobbit, and it was made by a knife called the Round-Eyed Knife and Tool Company, or RECAT. I think even Mr. Sal Glesser mentioned this. Check that one out. Now that's smaller, lighter, faster. I'm not talking tiny, but still a nice knife. I really like this. Leather authenticity. September 16th, 1996. Very cool. Limited edition of 52 knives. That version was made out of ATS 34 steel, Sub-Zero quenched, Rockwell hardness 58. Oh, can you imagine getting one of those new in box? How collectible and special that was. All right, so that's partially the history. I'm making broad strokes on this, and they wanted to make some training knives with it. I totally agree with that, since it's such a specific fighting style. What they want to do with a blade, make some training blades with it. The bad part of all this history, for the warrior knife at least, is that it wasn't produced for that long, and it wasn't really commercially successful. A knife, in order to withstand the test of history, it has to be commercially successful. Gaining more interest than just from collectors alone. Okay, so time goes on. There's a martial artist over there in Israel. His name is Mr. Guy Raffaelli. I think he was at SHOT 2010. We just missed him. We might meet him later in other videos. We'll talk to Guy. Another badass. You can read his qualifications. Where is it? Somewhere along here. That's what I was looking for right here. A summary of Guy Raffaelli's fighting resume. You can read it right there. Kempo, Western boxing, Filipino martial arts, full contact kickboxing, Israeli combat systems. Yeah, badass. He loved the warrior design, knew about it, would like to see it come back into reality. So my understanding is he made a prototype, called the good folks at Spyderco, got in contact with them, said, hey, listen, I have an idea of how we can bring this to light again. Would you be interested? I love Spyderco, man. They're open to things like this. And Spyderco, in their wisdom, goes, you know what? We are interested. That is a cool blade. And they knew of the history of the Warrior knife. Sal and company did. They said, yeah, let's see what we can do. So they took that knife with a few minor changes. 2010 production version Warrior knife by Spyderco. It is different than the original Warrior knife, whether you're talking about one of the original prototypes, the custom-made versions, the Almar version, the recap version. This is a smaller and lighter blade, is my understanding. Again, I've held the original Almar one, and I wasn't overly impressed. I think the blade thickness is just insane. Way too thick for its POU. That's just my mileage. Yours may vary. But this knife here is pretty amazing. One thing that's amazing to me, I'm going to jump around. I don't even have my talking points. I'm just going to freewheel this review. 8.4 ounces. That's pretty light, and it makes it very fast in hand. The Warrior does. Remember the POU. This is a knife that is primarily designed for martial bladecraft, as Sal calls it, as a lot of people call it. In other words, killing bad guys with the blade. I think in another review, by the way, I said, hey, I never want to do that knife fighting thing. Let me clarify that. What I'm talking about is I never want to get in a knife fight. Do you? You're insane if you do. I mean, that is not to say I wouldn't like achieving expertise in edged weapon combat. You know, more so than I think I have now. Definitely. But again, it's a life skill. I love this quote, by the way, from, was it? Let's see, Randy? No, I think it's Bob Taylor. He summarizes it succinctly. Check it out. He goes, knife fighting, I love this, is for effing morons. It simply doesn't happen unless it was planned. If that's the case, you're both guilty of being under the influence of stupidity and in possession of ignorance. Well said, Bob. I couldn't agree more. That's how I look at it. I don't want to be in a knife fight, and if you think you're going to square off with some guy in a knife and not come away bleeding, no matter what your blade of choice, no matter what your skill level is, well, skill level maybe, but chances are high you're going to be bleeding. Probably seriously injured. Okay, so let's keep it real. To me, the POU of this knife is a secondary weapon. That it'd be something on my LBE that I could extract in CQB ops, save my life with. You know, when it gets within, I don't know, 2 feet, 3 feet, dude, blade. You know, if blade's just as effective, if not more effective, than the gun. And it doesn't jam, doesn't need ammo. It's always there. Yes, you have to train with it. That's a POU. Along, and just like the Warrior knife, the original one I'm talking about, this knife has a system of use that is supposed to be employed with it. Trapping, grabbing, arcs, reverse grip, edge out, thrust, like so. That's how the knife is designed to be fought with. Not so much support. And then, actually, let me clarify that. The original Warrior knife was definitely that way. I think Guy, and I hope I get this right, Guy, I know he'll watch this vid, the intention here is that the Spyderco Warrior has just a little bit more versatility. It's not a dedicated edge out that you can actually go a forward thrust with it. Look at that sweep on that blade. How many reviews have I just waxed prophetic on how much I love belly on a fighting blade? I love it. I think the slash is the most devastating cut you can do. I also think the blade style of the current version of this Warrior knife, the Spyderco version, can thrust cut very well indeed. I almost threw this knife in the stabbing protocol. I almost did. I was like, man, I really want to go, you know, just do some cutting tests with it. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. It's an expensive blade. We'll talk about that. I just couldn't do it. I can tell you this, though, just from experience, this knife will pierce cut as well. Look at the blade sweep. Look at the strength of the tip. Okay? Pretty nasty. So, yeah, philosophy of use, you could study that of the Warrior knife. No doubt. I liked also how Guy Raffaelli said, well, you know, we want it to be a martial knife, you know, no doubt, but we also want it to maybe be able to flex into a utility POU, field craft, perhaps. That drive to the serrations, okay? And I think Bob Taylor originally suggested those serrations. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, it's Michael Echanis did. Bob Taylor, you did the pommel, right? The serrations varied a lot on the original Warrior knife, and they weren't really designed for cutting. They were designed for trapping the opponent's limb. So you're in the reverse grip, edge out, and then you could grab. They're very sharp and grabby, for lack of a better word. Let me show you a picture here. And then you could control your opponent and rip at the same time. Okay, there's Ed Rohn version. That version of serrations had the points on center line. The Almar was a little bit offset, but they're very steep. See that? They're not really designed for cutting. They're for grabbing and ripping flesh. You could probably do the same with these, but they have a utility function as well, that they can cut rope, they can cut fabric and whatever else. Interestingly though, Guy Raffaelli in his Israeli defense system practices throat cutting with this. And look at how that would capture the throat. Don't mean to be graphic, but we're talking about a martial knife here, guys, so we have to address it. Like that, and then it just brings it right there, and that's a devastating cut. I know, it's nasty. Going back to the original Warrior knife for that matter, it was designed to overcome the loss of fine motor skills. And that's kind of why they advocate, according to my understanding, reverse grip, edge out. That when you're under stress, you lose your fine motor skills, that this is going to be, according to their martial arts philosophy, a more effective knife fighting technique. And I don't really have a lot of camera room here to show the sweeps and to utilize that broad sweep of the blade and keeping the wrist straight, which will make it stronger and less susceptible to injury. So interesting philosophy all around. Another interesting design of the Spyderco version of this knife, along with its lightweight, which I absolutely love, is the steel they chose. The more I use it, the more I learn about it, the more I like it. Talking about the H1 steel choice in the Spyderco Warrior. Pretty sick, actually, and a very capable steel for this POU. First off, it's kind of hard to find the thickness that the design called for, specifically the Guy Raffaelli design. He wanted a 4mm thickness slab of H1. Apparently that doesn't grow on trees, and it took Spyderco a while to secure quality H1 steel in that thickness. Kind of delayed the production a little bit from what I understand. They finally found it from the Mayodo Corporation in Japan. That's where this steel comes from. Amazing steel, actually. Like Sal Glesser talked about in our booth review, it is a work-hardened austenitic steel. And that varies a little bit from your normal martenitic steel. In other words, an alloy steel that's heat treated and then quenched, which creates a hard crystalline structure called martenite. In that process, brittleness is created, and so they kind of have to re-temper the blade and find that magical quality, the best compromise of edge retention and toughness. And a lot of the martenitic steels feature that. Being an austenitic steel, the H1 goes through a different process. It actually isn't heat hardened, it's work hardened, which means the manipulation of the steel through rollers or presses, I suspect, is what's going to harden the steel and make it tougher. We are told by Spyderco, and I totally believe them, that the H1 blade on the Warrior possesses the same differential hardness properties of Japanese clay-tempered steel. Pretty cool, huh? In other words, on the spine here, this is not work hardened very much. On the initial bevel grind here, more work hardened. And then as we approach the edge, that's work hardened or manipulated until they achieve the hardness levels they need. Pretty cool, huh? Excellent steel, and more importantly, for a lot of users, completely rust proof. That's because it doesn't use carbon in its structure at all, according to my understanding. And again, I'm not Mr. Science when it comes to blade steel, so I'm sorry if I get a few details wrong. 0.1% nitrogen instead of carbon makes it impervious to rust. Pretty sick if you ask me. That adds to the cost too. H1, again, kind of rare in this format, 4mm thick in the grinding and the rolling procedure, differential hardening, what I'm talking about. I'm sure it ain't cheap, and that probably drives to the cost of this blade around again, I'm ballparking it, you can find it less, more, $215 for this Spyderco factory produced fixed blade fighting knife. That's the H1 steel though. I think it's a sick choice. By the way, just like most Spyderco blades, the Warrior out of box, I rarely do this, but I just have to demonstrate it, razor sharp. And a lot of guys will say, they may have a hard time warming up to the H1 steel. I say get, you know, a less expensive Spyderco knife that has it and start using it. You know, aqua salt or something along those lines. I think you'll dig it. I don't have tons of use in it yet. I'm getting more and more as time goes by with all the other blades I test. You know how that goes. Pretty impressed with the H1 though. How about the handle? Again, this drives to the POU, philosophy of use for the blade, how it's designed to be employed, mostly edge out, reverse grip like so. That's why you see it designed as such. You can see it swells in the middle. Has bi-directional texturing on the Zytel scales, which I think is very effective. And thankfully, they make it so you can take them off if you need to surface it. With this type of steel, you probably would never have to do that. It's completely, like I said, impervious to rust. Look at that pommel. Is that nice or what? I like it better than the original Warrior knife, which is that hexagonal cap, because it's lighter. Remember, the blade itself, 8.4 ounces. With attention given to that lightness and speed by Guy, the designer. And I think that's a huge plus for this knife. There's your lanyard hold. You want to equip it. Most guys probably would. Finger grooves here. How does it feel in hand, Nutnfancy? Sick! It feels sick. I keep saying that word. What I mean by that is it just feels right. It is very ergonomic. Reverse grip, forward grip. Again, a variance of philosophy with the Spyderco version. Forward grip is just as easily accommodated by that as well. I love it. Notice the guard. Original aficionados or historians of the Almar version and the original, I don't know, recat versions would know that that's a reversal, that it's facing outward instead of inward. I think that's a good idea. You know, they have a philosophy of why they did that, and so did the original Warrior knife, and that kind of gets back to the trapping and grabbing features of the blade. I like it because in the forward grip, it really situates the thumb nicely. You know, in the reverse grip, you can kind of put your hand fat against it without having it dig in. If it's arced back the other way, as I come down here, I guess it could flare around the hand. I'd actually have to handle and study the original Warrior knife a little bit more in order to know for sure. Let's talk about the sheath that comes with the Warrior knife. Currently, as of 2010, it is made by Spec Ops. They make some good stuff. I do think the Warrior would be best suited with a Kydex or maybe Bolteron plastic style of sheath. That's just me. I like those. They're very lightweight. They're trim, very easily adapted to LBE and belt use. You could say the same thing about this as well. The only issue I have with this mainly is the weight. About 6 ounces, 5.8 to be exact. It adds a little bit of weight to the whole loadout. It is a very high quality sheath though. MOLLE capable, as you can see. You can drop it down off a belt loop, weave it into LBE just like so. I don't really see a dedicated drain hole in there. By the way, the thermoplastic liner is retained with that screw right there. And that's the thermoplastic liner. The bad part of that, as it comes from Spyderco, it's very loose. You could actually turn the knife upside down. The knife will come right out unless it's secured by the retention strap. What did I do? I unbolted it from the sheath, took out my heat gun, and I heat formed it just a little bit. So it would apply some pressure to the blade. So just in case I'm not able to secure it with a strap, the knife still retains. Be careful if you do that. I mean, this is an expensive blade. You just want to compress that plastic liner just a little bit so it presses on there just a bit more. There's a sheath for the addition of a sharpening stone, which I never carry, just extra weight. I sharpen my knives differently anyhow. Maybe a multi-tool or a tactical folder. Maybe the Spyderco Stretch, previously reviewed and still beloved in the Nutnfancy project. Let's see if that fits in there. A little bit more weight and bulk. Yeah, that'll work. You can actually put that clip right like that. Wicked cool. The only real criticism I have of the sheath, other than the weight, is use an elastic retention strap. I'm not sure if that was called for in specification. Thankfully, they don't use Velcro. So glad to see that. It's a nice military grade snap. But notice when I try to undo it, there's stretch in that retention strap. For a fighting knife, I think that is bad. Your mileage may vary. In other words, I need to get my knife out. I have to overcome that stretch. You know, maybe there's something I'm missing on it. Probably am. Overall, pretty good sheath. Like it. Definitely a cool knife. Competitive options. What can compete with this? This is a dedicated fighting knife. You could make the case that the Warrior by Spyderco is actually, you know, like I've been saying, meant to be used in a certain style of martial blade craft. I think it's a little bit broader than that, maybe a lot more broader than that. I think as an overall defensive blade, the knife is outstanding. I think it can thrust cut, slash cut, forward and reverse grips. It can give non-lethal, perhaps lethal impacts by the pommel. It provides great finger protection. I didn't really mention that because of that excellent guard. You know, it has some utility function too on the back of the blade, the serrations, and heck, the blade too. You could use this in fieldcraft in certain ways. Would I go batoning with this? Probably not. So many other knives to do. But getting to competitive options, it's kind of hard to find a knife factory produced. There's probably a lot of semi-customs and customs out there that can compete very well with this knife. I don't know offhand what they would be, but I don't know. Let's just throw in some ones previous reviewed here in the Nutnfancy project by myself, the Boker Desert Dagger. This is a very cool knife. However, philosophy of use is completely different. This is designed for thrust cutting, very minimal belly for the slash cut. It could happen, sharp tip, two different fighting styles, don't you think though? But this is going to be a lot less expensive than the Warrior. Of course, it uses a much more conventional steel too, 440C if I remember right, on this Boker. This is a cool knife. I still love the Boker. Great sheath. That's the kind of sheath I was talking about. I wish the Warrior would have something like this, a Kydex sheath. It just begs for it. How about a cheap offering? What? Cold Steel Peacekeeper 2. Nothing fancy. That's not even in the same category. Well, I'm talking about more philosophy of use. This is a dagger style of blade. This has been reground, you know, by my buddies at Razor's Edge. Back that relief cut up a lot. Previously reviewed, by the way. This is a nice little dagger, believe it or not. It's a cost-effective one, too. Doesn't have anywhere near the guard protection that the Warrior does, but it has more belly, perhaps a little bit more capability of slash cutting. Oh, but nothing fancy. The Warrior's 10 times a fighting knife for that. I know, relax. I know it is, but tell that to the guy who gets stabbed by the Peacekeeper, too. Hey, dude, that knife in your chest, that's only a $20 knife, or whatever I paid for this. Oh, in that case, I should feel a lot better than I do. The guy won't care, man. One of my all-time favorites, Cold Steel Taipan. This is a reference dagger. Now we kind of get into kind of more in the ballpark of the Warrior. Yes, this is still a dagger. I know that. Different fighting style, different, you know, philosophy of use, but it does have some belly, and this thing is wicked broad and cut. It's like a mini broadsword, if you ask me. Still love it. Approaching the price of the Warrior, but still cheaper. I don't know. This is just some off the top of my head, competitive options. You know, what I'm trying to tell you, though, is in the realm of this style of knife, the belly, the choice of steel H1, the history, and everything that's going and included with this knife. I mean, this book alone is cool to have. Seriously, I couldn't put it down when I started reading it. It was just like a total read-through. Nice job, Michael. You're not going to find anything, is what I'm telling you. It pretty much stands alone. Quality is superb. I mean, if you've seen any of my Spyderco reviews, and there's dozens out there by now, Spyderco gets it right. I mean, they don't mess around. And I'm sure when they looked at their Guy Raffaelli design, they're like, okay, we're going to be as true as we can to it, make just a few variances on it for production reasons, and this is what you get. And fit and finish on this blade, superb. Two kinds of cool in spades. I mean, if you are an aficionado of fighting knives just for collectability, and that's a POU I don't really talk about, you ought to add a Warrior to your collection if you can afford it. It is an amazing knife, just by the history. And once you read the booklet and the story behind it, you'll understand that this evolution will have its own history. And it'll be looked upon as probably one of the best renditions of the Warrior design, if you were to ask me. I'm dead serious about that. May not have the collectability, because it's going to be mass produced, and to me that's a good thing because it's going to get into a lot more hands. And now what we know about tactical knives and fighting knives, I think this design can be commercially successful in 2010. Back in the 70s, the 80s, maybe not so much. I mean, it was such a new thing. There were very few people that knew about it except the very eclectic martial art, maybe tactical community that would buy the blades, mostly collecting, never even using them. I think the knife's going to rock. Again, value is in the eye of the beholder. How many times have I said that? It's expensive. I'm not going to lie to you. $215 around there, maybe more, maybe less. That's a lot to pay. It is a factory-produced blade. But remember the quality level. Remember the steel. Remember all you get with the knife. Oh, and I didn't mention this. I'm so glad I remembered it. Part of the proceeds go to these guys. Special Operations Warrior Foundation. There's their website, specialops.org. And how cool is this? Bob Taylor, Randy Warner, the initiators, the designers of the original Warrior knife, elected to give all their proceeds, royalties, if you will, to that organization. So yeah, a few of the dollars are going to go there. I think that's most outstanding. First type of cool, very effective fighting knife. Second type of cool, a storied history dating back to the 1970s, and those cool dudes, Warner, Taylor, even a Chanis to a small degree. Wicked cool. That is the Spyderco Warrior knife. Highly recommended by Nutnfancy, and this has been my review on the blade. Thanks for watching. See you later. What is this knife, Mr. Sal Glesser?
This knife is called the Warrior. It's a variation of the original Warrior design that's been around for probably 35 years. There will be a booklet that's being written now. Actually, it's been written, photos have been taken. We're getting ready to put it into a printed format that will come with the knife. Right now, the knife is being shipped without the booklet, and if you send in a little card letting us know you want the booklet, then we'll be able to send it to you as soon as it's printed. The booklet's being written by Michael Janich, who's been around the knife industry for a long time. The knife is one of the unique concepts in knives that was developed. It was designed for reverse grip edge out, and it's primarily a combat knife, what we call martial bladecraft, and the shape is designed to work with the body. So, for example, all of the arcs of the arm are taken into consideration when the knife is used for trapping or grabbing or any of the poking motions.
Right.
The guard is a little different than was on the original models. The original models had the guard coming in so that they could more trap the hand, but this variation was designed by Gary Raffaelli, who works with the Israeli military, and that was the original purpose of this knife. The original knife was drawn by Randy Warner and Bob Taylor. There was some input from Michael Chanis back in the 70s when they were working on the knife. It's been made by a number of people in a number of variations. Al Marr did a version of the Warrior a while back. Bob Taylor's Recat company did a number of variations of the Hobbit Warrior. The Sheath is made in the United States by Spec Ops, and they have their requirements together for military purposes.
We did a booth review on Spec Ops and make good stuff.
They make good stuff. The steel is H1.
Yep.
It's an austenitic steel that is work hardened, so it's differentially hardened by the amount of work that's being done. Guy Raffaelli wanted a 4mm thick H1, so it took a little longer to create the knife because of the ability to produce the steel in that thickness. We use a full serration at the top. That was the requirement of the design. In the original Hobbit, the serration is more sawtooth for trapping and grabbing and tearing rather than actually slicing.
Right.
But in this application, they wanted more slicing capability. The handle is skeletonized, so it's light, well balanced. The handle is injection molded. It has bidirectional texturing. It is removable and replaceable.
I want this knife.
Yes, it's a very beautiful design, and it's really been out of production for quite a few years from Almar. So it's sad to see a wonderful design go by the wayside, and to have it recreated in H1 steel by Spyderco is about as good as it gets.
I couldn't agree more. And the mere fact, Ed and Sal, that has a Spyderco logo on it, for fans like me that are passionate about your blades, it's like a seal of quality. That, I mean, if I were to pick any knife design like the Warrior design to be recreated, I could think of a handful of manufacturers whose name I would like to get stamped on them. Spyderco's one of them. It's just fit and finishes tops. H1 steel, Ed, do you have any, what do you think about it overall, especially in this application in the fighting blade?
it's an extremely durable steel. It's practically unbreakable. There were a couple of samples in the cabinet of blades.
We've lost Sal.
Of salt knives that were actually bent 90 degrees without breaking. The ductility is very important. And use, this knife will not hold an edge quite as long as some others, but you can restore the edge more quickly. It will actually strop or steel back, and it doesn't chip very easily at all. It's very difficult to chip. And of course the corrosion resistance. If this went down with the Titanic and you brought it up today, it would look the same after you cleaned it off.
Hey, is the guard made of H1 as well on this knife?
Yes.
100% H1. How about the screws?
Yes.
Really? All H1, everything on there.
If they're not H1, they're titanium. In order to get total corrosion resistance, you can't use but a few materials.
Understood. Price on that's kind of steep, is it not? Least list?
It's $399.95 MSRP. You should be able to find it at your stores for a little less money, but in that, if you would have bought this model from another maker, like say Almar, 15 years ago when it was available, it would probably cost you double that today. So having this knife available and brought back into the market is a wonderful thing.